What's up, everybody? Welcome into Shout, a Buffalo Bills football podcast on this Wednesday afternoon, April 16th. Ryan Talbot, we are 8 days away from the NFL draft. It is the final sprint, the final stages before we get to figuring out who the Buffalo Bills rookie draft class is actually going to be. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great, getting more and more excited about the draft here. Like you said, just 8 days away, so the final countdown is on.
We have some Bills news today to kind of start off with a veteran workout cornerback, which makes sense. I mean, the Bills still haven't really addressed the position in a way that I think fans and media members are satisfied with going into the draft. So we'll talk about that in a second. Then I wanted to raise the question because you see the mock drafts floating around across social media this time of year, and every once in a while you see an offensive player. It seems like the majority are cornerback, defensive tackle, safety. When you see a wide receiver in there, how does that make you feel? Does it feel like we're at the point where it's got to be defense because of the needs of tackle, maybe safety, and obviously a cornerback? Or do you think that there's a player out there that if the Bills land them at 30, you'll be okay with it? Well, we'll get to that later in the show. But Ryan, we got a big week coming up here, and it starts on Saturday. Let everybody know where they can find us this Saturday night.
Yeah, Saturday night, you can find us at Wingnuts, their original location. So we will be there live talking all things NFL Draft, Millersport Highway. We are looking forward to that show. Like I said, we're going to be talking all things NFL Draft, doing a mock draft of sorts that night. Cannot wait for that event.
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to do a mock draft. We'll have to talk about that. But I want to talk about, because I have an idea that I want to I sent you a couple days ago, which is a mock draft. And instead of actually going through the process like we did last year at Wingnuts, I want to talk about a couple different mock draft scenarios. So I think it'll be fun. We'll bring up some fans. We'll take some questions. 1402 Millersport Highway this Saturday night, 6 p.m. Set you up. I lobbed it up and you just couldn't really put it through the hole. No, this is my fault. I threw it in the second row of the first row, or the second or first row of the stands. A couple days later, we're doing something completely different this year with our draft coverage, Ryan. We've never done a live event on day one of the draft, but we're doing it this year. We're going to Turning Stone Resort Casino, the New York Rec and Social Club. We're doing a live watch party. So come out to that. You can hang with us. We'll talk Bills. We'll talk NFL draft. It's going to be a great time. We're pumped for that one.
Yeah, excited about that one as well. We'll be there right when the draft starts. We'll go live a little bit later in the night, and then we'll go live again after the Bills make their first round pick.
All right, so it was ESPN's Jeremy Fowler who reported today that the Bills are bringing in a veteran cornerback for a workout. And this is somebody that, Ryan, if you go back through the archives, whether it be our tweets, our stories going into free agency, around trade deadline, all those kinds of things, you'll probably find numerous, 6 to a dozen different instances where we've talked about James Bradberry being a fit for the Buffalo Bills. Now, a lot of this came 2, 3, 4 years ago, back when he was in Carolina, and then a stop with the New York Giants before he went to Philadelphia. Had one really good season there, kind of had a fall off in 2023, and then a significant injury last year, torn ACL that ended his season before it ever got started. The Eagles signed him to a 3-year contract before that injury. He goes through the one season. They end up making him a post-June 1st cut this offseason, so he's now on the market. What's the connection to the Bills? A former Panther, right? Brandon Beane was on the staff that drafted him back in Carolina in 2016. He is a guy that I think at his best, this is an exciting idea, but where we stand now with the James Bradberry that they would be signing, to me, this just fits into the Dane Jackson department of somebody you're familiar with, a guy that if you have to throw him out there, I saw it in the comment section here, is this Josh Norman all over again? Kind of. I think Bradberry is a little bit younger, but the injury concern is all the same. Where do you land here initially on this James Bradberry idea?
Yeah, it's just another veteran to throw into the mix. Obviously, wouldn't factor in the compensatory pick formula anyways, based on what I'm expecting him to get in a contract. But the fact that he was a post-June 1st cut means he doesn't factor in there. There's been talks, Matt, over the last few years about maybe he would transition to safety as well. So you could have a movable chess piece veteran of sorts that can play both positions. He can play a few different cornerback spots as well. The ties to the Bills, they'll go all the way back to Carolina 2016. McDermott's still there as well as the defensive coordinator, so knows the player very well. Best football is behind him. He was a second-team All-Pro, though, in 2022, a Pro Bowler in 2020. He has some accolades. It wasn't that far removed that he was still playing at a decent level, and he would know this system extremely well based on his brief time spent with Sean McDermott. So for all those reasons, I'm not against it. It would be a very cheap deal. Probably, I would even think of that minimum type of deal. But you mentioned the Achilles injury that he's coming off of from last season. The age, he's 31 right now, will turn 32, I believe, in August of this year. So he's getting up there. Best football is behind him. This would not stop the Bills, obviously, from drafting a cornerback very high. And based on their pre-draft visits and what we've seen, I would expect the Bills to take a corner in round 1 or round 2.
Spin in the comments over on YouTube say, I got to say, Matt and Ryan are pretty smart. They use the show just as an excuse to go to bars. That tracks, Spin, because we do go to a bar every single month at Wingnuts. It is a great time, and they're fun events where we get to kind of connect it with our fans in a completely different way. It's great to connect virtually via the comment section on the live show on social media platforms. This is a chance to get to know people. I mean, we've made some really good friends over the years at these live events, and they're kind of like a monthly excuse to get together, talk about the Bills, and no better time to talk about the Bills and their future than the draft. And this week coming up is going to be really exciting. The thing about Bradberry that's interesting to me is he's 2 years older than Rasul Douglas. So in a lot of ways, there seems to be more question marks with him. Now, you're probably going to get him at the bare minimum, right? So from a price perspective, it makes more sense to go with a guy that you could probably get on the vet minimum as opposed to Douglas, who's probably still out there fishing for a little bit more money. He played at about $10 million last year. He's probably looking for somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 to $10 million per season. And I think the fact that he's still out there shows you that maybe there aren't a lot of teams willing to give him that. You know, Bradberry, coming off of the injury, not playing at all last season, there's the additional question mark of like, all right, you bring him in. Are you even confident? I mean, you can only judge so much on a workout. They're going to bring him in. They'll send him through all the different drills and stuff. But until you get him on the building and seeing him actually playing football, I don't know how much you can count on him being a factor in the room. And then you bring up the great point about position question marks. Like, is he still going to be a cornerback at almost 32 years old? Are they going to try to move him to safety? Is that the kind of play to move him into that safety room as a veteran guy that can maybe find some success at this stage in his career? There's so many questions that go into this addition. And it could also just be like, hey, this is a guy that we really liked. Let's bring him in and have a conversation. Maybe something doesn't even materialize with him, or you get him in the building. Another option, remember a couple years ago, it was the linebacker, Christian Kirksey, who had also been a name linked to the Bills for a lot of different cycles. They finally get him in the building. He's there for a month. He never sees the field. They ended up releasing him. He ended up retiring. It could be a situation like that too. To me, it falls on the low end of the expectation specter.
Yeah, it's not anything that's going to change their draft plan in 8 days over that 3-day event. It's just a let's see what he can do at camp type of a scenario. And even worst case scenario, maybe a veteran on the practice squad, if he doesn't show that he's still of a caliber that you can count on a 53, somebody you could have as a vet coaching up younger guys, essentially kind of like what Micah Hyde was doing. And then in worst case scenario, break glass in case of emergency, elevate him when needed.
I looked at the PFF scores for him and Douglas, and they comparatively had a similar drop-off. Bradberry from 22 to 23, and then Douglas is 23 to 24. So these are guys that are kind of past their prime. And listen, I think Dane Jackson, the reason why I wouldn't be so excited about this addition for the Bills is mainly because I think Dane Jackson checks the box of a guy that you're comfortable with, gives you a high floor, like has already been starting football games over the last 2 seasons, has been in your system. Like you mentioned Bradberry knowing the Bill system. He never played for Bobby Babich. And like
right.
This new iteration of the defense, which I'm sure has new wrinkles. Who was it? I think it was even AJ Klein who said when he came in a couple years after playing in the system that it was a bit different. So I don't know if you need another one of those kinds of players. I think I'd much prefer, and listen, you can add a guy with the caveat being We're going to bring him to camp and see what it looks like. But I don't think, to your point, this should change anything. I think that you're going to have to add 2 more cornerbacks, getting them in the pipeline in this draft, whether it be an early addition. You're probably going to have to use one of those first 3 picks that you have on the position and then come back later in the draft. Maybe the Christian Benford approach of figuring out a way to get a guy in there that maybe you like, that you can get into the system and start to develop.
Yeah, I mean, we're right on the same page there. There's no reason to think that the Bills won't go with a cornerback somewhat high in this draft based on the visits, based on everyone they've been looking at, and then based on their need overall. Having someone on a rookie contract that you hope can start alongside Christian Benford would be really good as well, cap-wise, for a team that already has given out a lot of big contracts.
So the last time we talked, we were getting into some of the big visits. There have been a couple of new additions. What has been the one that has maybe popped your eyeballs open most since the last time that we talked?
I don't know if there were any that necessarily popped my eyes huge. I guess Jaden Blue, a running back, because just because of the position itself, the Bills met with him at the Combine along with ETN and Jordan James of Oregon. Those were the 3 that we knew about, at least, that they had formal visits with. And then they bring Blue in for a 30 visit. He was the first known running back to make a visit here with the Bills. And we're up to about 20 pre-draft visitors that have been reported. So there are 10, and there could be a few running backs in that mix. So I guess the sheer fact that they brought a running back in, he is a day 3 pick. He's not someone that is expected to be taken high. So the Bills just doing their due diligence. But I guess that one for me, is there someone different for you, or would it be Blue?
No, that was the one for me, because obviously there hasn't been a lot of running backs linked to them during this process. And, they're pretty set at the position if they're going into the season with James Cook. But he's an interesting late flyer that if you add a guy like him to the mix, at least you give yourself a little bit of insulation if you do decide to make a move on James Cook. I don't foresee that being the case. Did you see there's a video circulating that he was recently on a podcast, Cook, and they were doing kind of like a game where they were showing him a bunch of different logos for different NFL teams. And when the Jets and the Patriots and I think the Chiefs came up, he had some funny reactions.
Yeah, ripped up all the papers. And I know a lot of the fans are being tongue-in-cheek about it, but I saw a lot of reactions on social media about, I am comfortable giving him $15 million now after he ripped up the Jets logo and the Dolphins, and then the Chiefs was the other one. I feel like it might have been, I only saw that clip. I think it was Leonard Fournette that may have been with him as well, former Bills legend, that was here for all of a few weeks on the practice squad. He even said something about rip that one up too about the Ravens, if that was him. Again, I saw it in passing, but good to know that he's still, considering those his rivals right now with everything going on.
I do think it's good. We talked so much about the top 30 visits and what they potentially mean for the Bills draft plans. I do think what you can take out of this cycle is that the Bills have done their work on the positions that they need to address in this draft. Cornerback, defensive tackle, but specifically cornerback. And that tier beyond Johnson and Hunter, who are, at various points in the process are both expected to be top 10 picks. Now, Will Johnson, it's funny tracking his draft stock over the course of this cycle, because I was reading today that some people think because of the injury concerns that some teams have, listening to even Daniel Jeremiah and Dane Brugler talk about it on a podcast, some people are thinking that he could fall into the 20s, which then I think makes it really interesting that the Bills did all this work on the next tier when you're talking about the Amos of the world, the Hairstons, the Revels. Morrison. Is this something where you look at a guy like Will Johnson, who might be super high on your board? Did you do enough due diligence to know about his injury history? And is that somebody that you're willing to move up the board for?
I would think yes would be the answer there. It's also interesting because when he had his pro day, he didn't run the 40, but he did certain drills. There were a lot of beat reporters saying, he's a lock now for the top 12. Tested so well. He is a clean prospect from the off the field, from the leadership on the field, what he looks like when he is healthy, but the injury concerns could push him down. There's always a few players that they check most of the boxes for these teams that are picking high, but injury concerns are legitimate. You want to add someone into the mix here that you feel like is going to be on the field more than not, because availability is key. I still think he's well off the board before pick 30. Wouldn't shock me. I could see the Dolphins, in fact, being a target for Will Johnson with everything with Jalen Ramsey going on. Cornerback is a bigger need for them. But I think that because of the injury concerns, he could get pushed down like a lot of these other players that the Bills have looked at because of their injury history. Not maybe as serious as Morrison, Revel, these guys that are supposed to be going in round 2 of the draft, but still enough to push them down the draft board into the 20s.
All right, let's get to some draft scenarios. And if some of these play out, we talk so much about these defensive tackles where, Derek Harmon, Kenneth Grant, 2 prime targets for the Bills at 30, will very likely be gone by the time the Bills make their selection. So in that scenario, obviously you can pivot and maybe even make things more easier on yourself. If you have this clump of cornerbacks in a similar spot, you go to the podium, you make your pick fine, or maybe there's enough corners that you're really feeling the same about that you move back a couple of spots, let somebody come in and grab a quarterback for that 5th-year option, and boom, you've had some draft capital, maybe even added that 3rd-round pick that a lot of Bills fans are hoping the Bills add. But here's the big question. You got Tet McMillan, Travis Hunter. Let's put them in the wide receiver bucket just for now, for argument's sake. There's a lot of scenarios where the Bills can get down to the nitty-gritty of their pick, and only those 2 guys have gone off the board. Probably Golden too, but let's just say for the sake of argument, he's still on the board. You get to 28, 29, those guys are still on the board. So now you're sitting there, if you're Brandon Beane, and you have your pick of, say, a Golden, say a Luther Burden, who I think is an interesting name as we get through this process. Like, go back to the beginning of the season when we were talking about the draft experts, like what are the big top targets to watch over the course of the college football season. Luther Burden's name was on most of those lists. And you go through this process and maybe some of the combine stuff or some of the other stuff, make that the hype around a player drop a little bit. If one of those players on the board and Brandon Beane pulls the trigger to go get a wide receiver at 30 with the needs that they still have on the defensive side of the ball, where do you land on that? And is there a specific name that moves the needle enough for you to say, okay, that makes sense in that spot? Or if it's best player available, go do it because you believe in that kind of philosophy.
If it's truly the best player available, by all means, do it. That's what Brandon Beane's always done. I don't know how they would stack up, though, with Trey Amos and even Hairston Jr., if you're talking about cornerbacks. Some of the defensive tackles, I don't know if there's any premier players left at pick 30. But, Luther Burden, I see in the comments here, JC is the slot guy. I think he best fits in the slot, but he has the ability to play on the outside. I think he can do both. I like him a lot as a prospect. I don't love him as a prospect necessarily. Matthew Golden has received a lot of hype lately. I'm expecting him off the board, but if he's there, I could see him potentially being one of their higher players. What this goes back to me is the Bills have done a lot of due diligence on speed wide receivers in this draft class. I don't think they've looked at someone that's run slower than a 4.4 40-yard dash. And some of those players that the Bills could take at 30 that you mentioned would fit that criteria. But I've also seen Josh Allen win MVP last year when he didn't have an elite wide receiver, someone that helped him out, made life easier for him. And that doesn't mean just sit there and never take a wide receiver high, because Allen can win without them. But I don't think that this draft class necessarily compares to last year's, where, Brian Thomas Jr., a prospect that you loved, you were beating the table for Brian Thomas Jr. I don't think that any of those players are necessarily that Brian Thomas Jr. caliber that could be there at pick 30.
So Matthew Golden is the closest thing to that in this year's draft class. Different player. Like, I don't think he has the ceiling of what we saw in rookie season, Brian Thomas Jr. And honestly, I don't even think I knew how elite he was going to be right from the jump. But I do think that, like, Golden as a boundary speed option that can run a pretty solid route tree and somebody that you can kind of develop behind a cast of characters that do various things in this wide receiver room. I think he would give them something that they don't already have. I don't think you need to trade up for Golden, the same way I thought it was worthwhile to trade up for a guy like Brian Thomas Jr. And so now you look at how do you get through the weeds of sitting here saying, okay, you need a cornerback, right? I feel like we're right back in the same spot the Bills were in 2022 when they went in and they drafted Kyle Elam. And listen, there could theoretically, Ryan, be a run on cornerbacks early in the 20s, right?
Mhm.
Like people talking about Amos, people talking about Hairston Jr., people talking about even Revel. I've seen him mocked to the Vikings at least 5 times over the last week. So if that run happens and you have somebody specific on your board that you feel like fits in a perfect scenario, what do you do in that situation? Because I almost think that you now have to be aggressive for that spot if there's somebody specifically you've zeroed in on with all of these opportunities to get to know these prospects in the way. You better get the guy that you really truly believe in. And then you're now in another situation because of the offseason, how it's played out. You might not be able to sit and wait and take best player available and avoid this position, because if you wait till 56 or 58, whenever they're picking for the 56, I think it is, there might not be a player at the caliber that you need to be able to slot in across from Christian Benford.
Yeah, I would hope that they wouldn't just press for one because of the need, but I get that point. I would say that Benjamin Morrison, a player that I think will go in the second round, is a first round talent. It's just the hip injury that he's coming off of that will most likely push him to round 2. So if they went with Morrison, I personally uh, would like the pick. I've watched him for multiple years at Notre Dame. I know that he is one of the best
You,
corners in this
you like
draft.
Morrison?
When healthy. Yes, absolutely. Listen, I pound the table for certain Notre Dame guys, 100%. Not all of them, but certain ones for
Who have you
sure.
like been really vehemently against that was a Notre Dame guy?
I don't know if there's anyone I've been like against strongly, but I didn't pound the table for anyone since like Kyle Hamilton. I was a big Kyle Hamilton
Right.
guy.
Right.
So there's no one that I'm sitting there saying you got to get them. And the Bills don't have a great track record of drafting Notre Dame guys. They drafted 2 players in round 6 of the 2001 NFL draft, and that's the last time they've drafted a Notre Dame player. So not a lot of ties there, but there is a ton of defensive talent there in Notre Dame now. Not all players that are draft eligible, obviously, but I wouldn't be against it right now, especially with Morrison, who talent-wise stacks up with all of these guys when healthy.
And the interesting thing about the conversation between defensive tackle and cornerback is that cornerback is a need for like a day one starter. Whereas I think defensive tackle, you have a little bit more of a runway to
Mhm.
develop a player behind Daquan Jones for a while, at least, right? When Larry Ogunjobi comes back 6 weeks into the season, you can even run a couple of sets with Oliver and Ogunjobi on the field at the same time in pass rush situations. So you're not in a scenario where you have to be overly aggressive. Now, if you can get in range to get a difference maker, if you believe that Derek Harmon's that guy and he's there at 22 and you don't want him to kind of be available to the Ravens of the world, the Texans of the world, whatever, I could see being aggressive for a player like that. But in terms of like the need for cornerback, it's going to be so interesting to see how this thing plays out. Like the mock drafts for so long, the corners were hanging around for the most part all the way into the mid to late round. And now you're starting to see them getting gobbled up even earlier. I think that that's worst case scenario for the Bills when they get into the draft, is if there's a significant run on corners before it gets to like pick 25 or 26.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a month ago, you were probably banking on 2 cornerbacks going in the first 2, 3 picks. And now Sanders is starting to slide, and there's talk maybe those will be the only 2 quarterbacks that go in round 1. You don't know about Jackson Dart. There's some other guys that are getting pushed up and elevated more so to round 2. So those are like positions where you're hoping guys go off the board. You're hoping there's 3 quarterbacks that go, that there's 2 running backs that go in this draft before pick 30, kind of push that talent down to the Bills, or of positions that aren't as pressing of a need. Offensive linemen, O-linemen, tackles. The Bills are set there with their starters. You're hoping there's a run on that, and that way corners and D tackles do fall into their lap. That's the beauty of this draft. We're sitting here today saying, no way Derek Harmon is going to follow Buffalo, but 8 days from now, we could be sitting here and it could happen. stranger things have happened, and that's what I'm looking forward to the most when it comes to this draft starting next Thursday night.
The recent track record of the trades up for Brandon Beane, I mean, obviously Dalton Kincaid is the most recent example. The Kyer Elam one is the most damning. I think that will give Brandon Beane pause in general, depending on how high he wants to move up in the draft. The more you do these mock drafts, though, the more I think the trade back option gives you the opportunity to land potentially 3 to 4 guys in the hot zone of this draft. And I think it could be like a really aggressive plan that could play out that could yield a really nice return, like a trade back that gives you some good later assets and then aggressively moving up with maybe one of those second round picks. And now you're talking about 3 guys, maybe if you could somehow come out of it in the top 60, that's a really interesting opportunity for the Bills. So now you could throw multiple darts instead of putting all your bags in a Kyer Elam or Dalton Kincaid like approach to hopefully land one guy that can come in and be a difference maker. Now, you do need one of those guys to be the cornerback, but you get my point. I mean, I think that there's a couple of guys like at edge rusher, the kid from Arkansas, Landon Jackson. He's really interesting. He's going to be probably at the top of the second round. Some people are so high on him that it could be late first round. There's some other corner guys that I think are really interesting. What do you think of the kid Porter, Darian Porter?
I like him as a round 2 prospect. I don't know if I'm as sold on him as some of the other players that the Bills are in range of, but someone I wouldn't be opposed to the Bills drafting based on the way they have developed guys over the years. Elam being the outlier that they couldn't necessarily get to fit the mold. So I think the talent is there for sure, not against that. But a trade down at 30 is ideal if those blue chip players that you love, the Trey Amos is off the board, Kenneth Grant, all the D tackles that you had a first round grade on. Yeah, slip into round 2, have 3 second round picks, possibly add a third round pick, and then you're drafting 4 players that wouldn't necessarily all be starting as rookies, but would be major contributors. If you have 4 picks in rounds 2 and 3, hypothetically, let's just say that's how it worked out, or if they traded some of their day 3 picks to get another one on day 2, you could address major needs: D tackle, cornerback. You can get an edge rusher if you want, wide receiver. You could look at a linebacker. They like Chris Paul Jr., Pooh Paul, as he's known by. So those are guys that you could target on that second day of the draft and feel really good about the strength of what you've added, not just for 2025, but long term.
I ask about Porter, who's got a 3rd, 4th round grade from Dane Brugler in his draft guide. The Iowa State corner measures in at 6'2", 195, ran a 4.3 at the combine. Obviously some measurables. I've seen him in, late second round mock draft. So like you're talking about a guy like him, maybe like a Noel Williams out of California. When you listen to all the draft experts, and obviously Jeremiah and Brugler at the top of my list when I'm consuming this time of year, the people that rave about the Cal DB, specifically Noel Williams, I mean, they're absolutely smitten with the guy. And you look at a player like this and you wonder, okay, if the Bills lose out on one of these top tier guys and they end up with a Noel Williams, but one of the top defensive tackle prospects or edges like a Jackson out of Arkansas, I think you like that combination, whichever way it kind of plays out.
Yeah, there's options. The Bills, the 30 visits don't mean that these are guys that they're going to draft necessarily. A lot of the corners have injury history or off the field concerns, or at least a good chunk of them do. It's due diligence and some of the private workouts too. It all matters at the end of the day. It's kind of, okay, who do they meet with the most? Who have they looked at a lot throughout the year? But there could be someone that isn't on our radar because they didn't have a 30, they didn't have a private workout or a Zoom that we know about, but the Bills are really high on. So there's definitely options out there. It's all about finding guys that you feel like fit, one, from what you do on the field, but two, also what you've built up here in terms of the attitude of the player, everything else. It all matters to the Bills at the end of the day when it comes to the draft. And there's going to be a few players that aren't on our radar that they end up selecting.
It is an exciting couple days here on Shout. We're going to have Dane Brugler on the podcast from The Athletic. That will air tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. And then make sure you come out, if you're able, on Saturday night to Wingnuts, 1402 Millersport Highway, live draft special. Ryan and I will be hanging out all night talking about the Buffalo Bills draft options. If you're really feeling adventurous, you could come on the live show, ask a draft question, or just talk about a draft take. And we'll do that at Wingnuts. 5 days later, Turning Stone Resort Casino, Verona, New York, just outside of Syracuse. We are coming there for a live draft party on day one. We will do a live show during the early part of the round. We will obviously react to the Bills draft live in-house, and then we'll do a post-first round episode of the podcast as well. It's going to be a jam-packed next week here, Ryan, on the Shout Podcast.
Yeah, and it's going to be a fun jam-pack. Tons to talk about both before and after the draft. Looking forward to it, Matt.
I got a fun idea that I'm going to toss out on Saturday night. So make sure, if you can't come out to Wingnuts, you're tuning in. I'll put it to the test as Ryan can kind of rip it down and tell me I'm an idiot. It'll be really fun.
Looking forward to it.
All right, for Ryan, I'm Matt. We'll see you soon. Take care, everybody.